Thank you very much. I suppose that the advantage of going after a great big lunch is that if you fall asleep, I can blame it on the lunch rather than on my talk. So I have a little bit less time than I had anticipated. I have a prepared PowerPoint, but I'm going to probably be zooming through it, so don't try to read everything as I go from one slide to the next. How many of you think that it would be socially irresponsible for a city to spend $10 to $15 billion to host a big party for 17 days? How many of you think it would be irresponsible to spend $10 to $15 billion to host the Olympics for 17 days? All right, that's all I need to say. So a lot of people who criticize using public money for sports stadiums, for hosting the World Cup, for hosting the Olympics, make the argument that spending the money on those frivolous things rather than on pressing social needs, education, healthcare, other needs, is irresponsible. I would like to suggest a little twist to that argument, and the twist is this, that if it were the case that a city could spend 10, 15, some other amount of money hosting the Olympics and get back more money from their hosting experience, that it wouldn't be socially irresponsible. Los Angeles did that, for instance, in 1984, and they used their surplus of $320 million, which in today's dollars isn't so much. Back then it was a lot more. They took that surplus and they invested it in youth sport programs throughout Los Angeles. The problem is that much more often than not, the Olympics don't generate a surplus for the host city. They generate deficits, and deficits on the order of billions and billions of dollars. So the IOC, in order to counteract this reality, and I'll try to persuade you in the next 25 minutes or so that it is the reality, in order to counteract the reality that cities lose money, and a lot of it when they host the Olympics, has a very powerful propaganda machine, and they make extravagant claims about what the Olympics, hosting the Olympics does for a city or country. I have a few examples of that on the screen. The chair of the London 2012 Olympics, Sebastian Coe, said London 2012 was a once-in-a-generation opportunity to showcase everything that makes Britain great in order to generate long-term economic benefits. They also hired Grant Thornton, a consulting agency, to do an economic impact study, and obligingly Grant Thornton came out with the conclusion that it would create a gain in economic activity of up to $40 billion. For the Rio Olympics in 2016, the University of Sao Paulo and Ernst & Young did a study, and they concluded that it would help the Rio economy to the tune of $100 billion. And then there's the famous statement by Jean Drapeau, who was the mayor of Montreal in 1976, who said that the Olympics can no more have a deficit than a man can have a baby. And the Montreal Olympics went on to have a cost overrun of 9 times. There are also some interesting claims that get made by the IOC spokespeople about inclusion and participation. For instance, they claim that they have 206 nations participating in the Summer Olympics, but the United Nations says there's only 196 nations in the world. They also like to tout that local cities experience a great wave of volunteerism, which changes the culture in the city. In Rio, they said that initially there would be 75,000 volunteers. Eventually, just before the Olympic Games, they reduced that number to 50,000. It turned out that 9,000 of those were from outside of Brazil, and of the 41,000 who were from Brazil, 15,000 quit the job of volunteering after 2 days. They had received their uniforms, which they wanted to get, and they were complaining of inadequate meals, no housing or transportation coverage, and poor training to do their jobs. The reality, I think, if you look at the structure of the IOC, is that it's an organization of exclusion. The IOC has roughly 100 members. Many of them are royalty coming from around the world. The rest are very well connected and members of local business elites. The IOC has begun to sponsor the Olympics not as an athletic event, but as a construction event. And accordingly, construction executives, construction companies, their associated trade unions, affiliated investment banks who are going to float the bonds to raise the money to build the stadiums and so on, and a few other people from the corporate community in a host city will be the ones who are pushing the bid, the ones who are controlling the OCOG, or the local organizing committee. So there have been, over the last 20 years more or less, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 empirical studies using econometrics, trying to tease out what the effect was on the local economy in terms of employment, in terms of per capita income, and some other variables. What was the effect from hosting the Olympics? These studies almost uniformly come to the conclusion that there was no positive effect. That the variables that they're looking at are not statistically significant. There are one or two cases where particular sectors of the economy, such as the tourism sector or the hospitality sector, experienced a short-term gain in employment. But anytime there was a gain, it was always a short-lived gain. So I think the basic gestalt that I have in thinking about the Olympics, and it's something that I'd welcome afterwards to talk about it with regard to some of the leagues that were being discussed this morning, and Joe's comments about the number of spots available for professional soccer players is staying the same, but the world keeps growing, the population grows, and the people who want to play professional soccer keep growing, and that creates certain pressures for the potential participants. The same kind of idea is applying with the IOC. The IOC is a monopoly. It's the only organization in the world that organizes the Olympics. Ted Turner tried to do it in the 1990s with the Goodwill Games. He failed. The IOC simply had too much resources, too much branding to compete against. So they're the only organizers. They're the only producers of the Olympic Games. And since they're international, they don't have a government that sits over them. There's no Federal Trade Commission. There's no antitrust division of the Justice Department to control any potential monopoly abuses. So here they go out every 4 years, alternated by 2 years with the Winter and the Summer Games. They go out and they say to the cities of the world, convince us that you're the most worthy person or you're the most worthy city to host the games. And the cities, generally speaking, they've hit some bumps in the road with their traditional model, but generally speaking, the cities fall over themselves, convincing the IOC that they're going to put more money into the stadiums, build more elaborate stadiums and other facilities, better transportation from one facility to another, better security, and on and on and on. And so what happens is that the price of hosting the Olympic Games has gone higher and higher and higher to the point where these days it's in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 billion for the Summer Games, and it's maybe 5 billion, could be even a little bit lower for the Winter Games. Part of the problem here is that cities, as I suggested a moment ago, cities that bid are not bidding as independent cities. They're bidding as representatives of local business interests, usually in the construction industry. And the construction industry doesn't have it in its own self-interest not to win the bid. So they're bidding with other people's money when they make those bids. And that's yet another force that pushes these bids higher and higher. So thinking about the economic impact, and I'll come more specifically to issues of inclusion and participation in a moment. But thinking about the short-run economic impact, here's what we can say. Simply to bid for the Olympics alone, for a city to bid for the Olympics, it costs somewhere between $60 and $100 million. One often hears that if you go to Rio in 2015, or you go to London in 2011, or Vancouver 2009, pick your city, you go the year beforehand, you see a tremendous amount of construction activity. Thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of construction workers all over the place. And people point and they say, see what I told you, look at this, economic activity, the city is growing. The problem with that argument is several-fold. Probably the most significant part of the problem is that construction that's going on is being financed by debt, and the debt is going to have to be paid back. And that means that the city government or the state or the provincial government is going to have to find the money in their budget to pay off the debt service, the interest and principal, probably for another 20 or 30 years. And that means that they have that much less money to spend on other construction projects or other social benefit projects. Another issue here is that there's so much construction that goes on. For the Summer Games, you have to build, these days, 36 or 37 athletic venues. You've got the Olympic Village, which has to house somewhere in the neighborhood of 11,000 athletes, their trainers, coaches. You need an Olympic Village for 17,000 plus people. The Olympic Village is actually a village. It's not just a bunch of apartments. You have to have training facilities. You have to have medical facilities. You have to have entertainment facilities. You have to have food venues and so on and so forth. So you're building a village for 17,000 people. You have 37 roughly athletic venues. You have a media village that you have to build. You have a media production facility you have to. There's so much construction that goes on. And it takes up somewhere in the neighborhood of between 1,600 and 8,000 acres of land, of scarce urban land. There's so much construction that goes on that you don't have enough construction workers in your local city economy to do all the work that needs to be done. And so what do? Like what they're doing in Russia now in building for the World Cup, you bring in workers from North Korea, you bring in workers from other areas in Asia, and you pay them paupers' wages and treat them inappropriately. So the construction argument doesn't really hold a lot of water. I mean, you could just as well argue that the mayor of any city in the United States should hire 1,000 workers to build a big hole in the middle of the city and then hire another 1,000 workers to fill up the hole, and that would be good for the economy. It's not so. And in fact, one of the problems, as I'll mention in a moment, one of the problems with doing all of this for the Olympics is not only do you spend billions of dollars building the facilities, but then you have to do something with them. And that costs money. More on that in a moment. Tourism. We're told that there's a tourism boost from hosting the games. Well, here at best it's a mixed bag. Lots of evidence, some of it I have on the board, that's about cities that hosted the Olympics where the actual number of visitors during the month of the Olympics, whether it was August or it was February, depending on winter or summer, actually went down. In Beijing, it went down by 30%, according to official statistics. And not only did fewer tourists come to the city, but there was an outflow of people who wanted to get out of the city because they're afraid of the congestion and the higher prices and possible security incidents. So the outbound tourism from China, from Beijing, outside of the country, actually went up 12% during the month of the Olympics. So basically, what happens is that in most cases, is that the normal tourists get scared away. They don't want the congestion, the high prices, the security issues, and the Olympic tourists come. The Olympic families come, 25, 30, 40, 50,000 people associated directly with the athletes themselves. And there's a balancing. Some cities end up slightly above, some cities end up below. They lose money from hosting. But a more interesting issue with regard to the Olympics is this. If you look at studies that have been done by tour operators in Europe, in the United States, in South America, and elsewhere, what they say is that the most effective way to promote tourism is word of mouth. The most effective way to promote tourism in London is to have somebody go and do a typical vacation in London. So you go to the theater, you go to the London museums, you go to the Tate galleries, you have a few nice dinners, you walk around Hyde Park, you come home and you tell your friends, neighbors, and relatives that you did all those things and you had a great time. What happens when you host the Olympics and sometimes other mega events is that people who are in London during that 3-week period are not going to Piccadilly Circus, they're not going to the theater, they're not doing the traditional stuff. They come back and they tell their friends, neighbors, and relatives, I saw a great 100-meter medley swimming race. And obviously their friends, neighbors, and relatives can't go to London to watch the race from the Olympics again. And so the word of mouth component of tourism is undermined. Another issue is that cost overruns are ubiquitous for Olympic hosts. There's a study done out of Oxford University, actually 2 or 3 studies that were done, and they found that for the Summer Games since 1976, which was the Montreal Olympics, the average cost overruns was 252%. So the final amount that was spent was 3.52 times the initial bid that was put out. And I have on the screen a bunch of specific examples of that. The question is why? How come this keeps on happening? And I think the answer is pretty obvious. What happens at the very beginning of a bid is that the OCOG, the Olympic Organizing Committee, has to get the buy-in from the local city council or the state legislature or other political bodies. In order to get the political buy-in, they produce a skeletal, low-budget version of what is eventually going to happen. They want to make it seem as politically acceptable, as politically and economically acceptable as possible. So they produce a contrived small budget. Once the city has the political buy-in, then they start adding the bells and whistles. And then they're in an international competition with other cities that also want to host the Olympics, and they have to one-up the other cities. So the price goes higher and higher. Another factor or feature that pushes cost overruns is that when you're building for the Olympics, there's no leeway. If you're building a commercial center, if you're building a mall, if you're building apartments, you have a projected date. You say, okay, the apartments are going to be ready in September of 2019 or whatever. But you can then announce two months beforehand, gee, there's a lot of rain this summer and it's not going to be ready till October, or whatever the case might be. You can't do that with the Olympics. If the Olympics are supposed to start on July 15th, you can't say, gee, we need another 2 weeks. They're not going to be ready. The Olympic Stadium won't be ready until July 25th. So there's a hard deadline. It's a firm deadline. Because it's a firm deadline, you're going to the construction firms and saying, you're signing a contract with me that says July 15th, it's ready. The construction company says, okay, that means I have to prioritize all my other projects. I have to prioritize this over all my other projects. I have to prioritize the shipment and delivery of materials. I have to prioritize the availability of my labor force. So instead of charging you $150 million for this facility, I'm going to have to charge you $250 million. Very often, the people who are at the OCOG, working with people who are in the city government, don't have a choice in that circumstance. And another thing that ends up happening is because things are invariably rushed, even in the best managed cities. Things are rushed during the last several months to make sure everything is ready, is that they throw out the window normal competitive bidding practices. So a lot of things like this start collapsing on the situation, and if the country or the city that happens to be the prospective host is also a city or a country that has a history of corruption, which applies to just about everywhere, I guess, to one degree or another, then that corruption is fully engaged during this process. I'm not doing very well on time, am I? So where's Stephen?
Here.
Okay, there you are. So you want me to leave 15 minutes for questions?
Yes.
And you want
to be there by 1:30.
Okay. All right. So what do I do? So let me. Yeah, so let me. I'm going to really do a very quick summary of a lot of different things. One of the things that then happens at the end of all of this in the short run is that for the Summer Olympics, if you're coming from a developed country, not from less developed countries where they have to build more infrastructure, like they did in Sochi, like they did in Beijing, like they'll have to do in Qatar for the 2022 World Cup. But if you're coming from a country that basically has a developed transportation and hospitality and security infrastructure, it's going to cost you $15 to $20 billion. How much money do you bring in? Somewhere around $3.5 to $5.5 billion. So there's a short-run deficit there. You can make it go away with some fancy accounting. You can't make it go away. You could diminish it with some fancy accounting, which they do, and I'd be happy to tell you about it. But there's still a deficit. And whether it's a deficit of $5 billion or $10 billion or $15 billion is a deficit. Well, the IOC will argue to you, and others will argue, that it's okay to have a short-run deficit because there's such large long-term benefits. That by hosting the Olympics and being on a few billion television sets around the world, you're going to encourage foreign investment. You're going to encourage foreign trade. You're going to encourage international tourism. All of those things are logically plausible. Empirically, we don't have any evidence that that happens, frankly. And if you think about it, if you pause to think about, is a company going to invest in London because they saw them on television in the Olympic Games? Or does a company rather say, does London have good access to the raw materials that I need? Does London have good access to the markets that I serve? Does London have a skilled labor force that I need? Does London have good amenities? Does it have a good fiscal structure for my company? And on and on. There are 10 or 15 questions like that you ask, and then maybe at the end, There might be an executive out there in the world that'll say, oh, they hosted the Olympics, so let's choose London. But the fact of the matter is it doesn't happen. We don't have evidence of any of those things coming to pass. All right, so I want to turn to talk. I obviously don't have much time. I want to talk a little bit about issues related to inclusion and participation. I think having established that you don't get, even though you invest I started out by asking if you invest 15 or 20 billion, but you get more, isn't that arguably good for participation and inclusion? I think the answer probably would be yes. But I hope I've established, however briefly, that doesn't happen. There are a couple of cases, Los Angeles, maybe Barcelona in '92, a couple of cases where it happens under special circumstances, but generally it doesn't happen. The IOC has too much power to make that happen. So in addition to the financial deficits that are created, there are lots of other very serious issues. One of them is land, the opportunity cost of land. I got involved studying the Olympics back in 2003. Jerry Schoenfield from the Schubert Corporation in Manhattan. They own or run practically all the Broadway theaters in Manhattan. He was concerned that New York was bidding to host the Summer Games in 2012. And their plan to host the Summer Games in 2012 was to put a concrete platform that was going to back then cost $400 million over the open rail yards, the Long Island Railroad between 31st and 33rd Street and 10th and 11th Avenue. And then they were going to build the Olympic Stadium on top of that. And after the Olympics were gone, they were going to use it as a stadium for the New York Jets football team. That's an NFL team. They play 8 games there a year. So what you're doing, those of you who are at all familiar with Manhattan, is you're taking land that is adjacent to Broadway theaters on a part of New York that's a little bit elevated, that looks out over the Hudson River onto the Jersey Palisades. This has got to be some of the most valuable real estate in the whole world. And you're using it for an Olympic stadium and a football stadium. This is an example, maybe it's an extraordinary example, but it's an example of the reality that the Olympics, to host the Olympics, you have to give up more than 1,000 acres, more than 1,600 acres, sometimes, in the case of Beijing, over 8,000 acres of land. It could be very valuable land that could have other uses. Another thing is that because you're using so much land to host the Olympics, there's a problem with community evictions. And this is ubiquitous. It's worse in some places. It's not as bad in other places. In Rio, for 2016, 77,200 favelados, residents of the shanty towns of the favelas, were evicted. And most of them were sent 10 miles to the west of the city. And because of the transportation situation there, they had to leave their jobs. And the kids, of course, were extracted from their schools and their communities. So it's a big deal. And you had a similar situation with Atlanta in 1996. 1.25 million people were evicted from homes in Beijing, and the list goes on and on. Another issue is environmental degradation. I suspect that many of you have read about this in connection with various Olympic Games. But again, the list is very, very long. In the most recent cases, the Pyeongchang Olympics, they had the white elephant of the Olympic Stadium that was used twice for the opening ceremony and the closing ceremonies. It cost $110 million to build. They tore it down. In the case of the ski run that they had on Mount Gariwang, they had to but they cut down 50,000 trees in order to build the ski run. They're talking about replanting the trees to regenerate the forest there. They're talking about it. They don't know what they're going to do with 2 of the ice skating rinks. In Beijing for the 2022 Winter Olympics, the plan is they have these two slopes, one for the Nordic and one for the alpine skiing. One's 60 miles north of Beijing, one is 120 miles north of Beijing. This is a water-starved area of China. There's a very, very acute, severe water shortage. You must know about it in this area. To host the 2008 Summer Games, they had to spend $80 billion to move water from the south of China up to the north of China. Now they're going to need more water. These two areas are very close to the Gobi Desert. They get 8, 12 inches of total precipitation a year. They're going to have to make artificial snow in these areas. So they're going to have to transport more water. This is also a very important agricultural region in China. So the agricultural use of the water will be diminished because of these ski slopes. Who's going to ski in China? It's not a very popular sport. To the extent that it becomes a sport that people participate in, it's going to be the wealthiest people in China. So there are, I think, large numbers of implications around the environment and around income distribution and participation as a result of the way the Olympics are organized. One final thing I want to, no, I won't. Okay, let me. I was talking to Stephen before when we were waiting for everybody to sit down, and we were talking about discussion that we'll all have later in the afternoon about what to do about it. And I was interested. Somebody asked the question before: "Is we're doomed because of international capitalism, and there's no way around it." Let me talk just for a minute about a way in which I think some of these issues could be constructively attacked. And I think that it's this. There's no reason to rebuild the Olympic Shangri-La in a new city around the world every 4 years. It doesn't pay off. Cities, in fact, are increasingly saying, no thanks, we don't want to do that. When they have referendums, people are voting that way. It just doesn't make any sense. It's financially wasteful, it's environmentally wasteful, it's socially disruptive. So what should be done? What should be done, and it will only be done if there's a lot of political pressure and a lot of pressure from IOC corporate sponsors, what should be done is there should be one permanent place that hosts the Olympic Games. Maybe it should be somewhere between Athens and Olympia. The problem I see there is I don't think that the Greek government has the money to do all of the construction, but maybe it could work there. Maybe what should happen is the IOC should issue a $30 billion bond and do the construction for them. And then it gets used as an international training center, and it gets used for other kinds of international events. It's not something that's built for 17 days, used once every 4 years, or a situation where you have to get rid of all of the buildings after you erect them. So I think that there's a model out there, and if you envision that model, then we're no longer in a situation of the traditional business model, which is every city in the world competing against each other in order to convince the IOC that they're most worthy. And so some of the freneticism and disregard for the social and environmental and financial issues would disappear. It seems to me that's the logical place to go. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for this great talk. I come from Istanbul, that has been a capital to the Olympics for as long as I can remember, decades. And I just want to say the toll that it takes, even when the IOC came to visit and Istanbul wanted to prove to them there was no traffic, they rerouted traffic for one day to prove that they could get from A to B in 10 minutes, where the rest of the city had to stay in traffic for twice the price. So that was only one day they told us that it took. Another thing I want to say is that lately it has become more palpable how the government is using the Olympics to promote their ideology, as a tool of self-promotion, basically. So many of us who had been rooting for the Olympics when we were little have switched and are now against our own city getting the Olympics because it will only solidify the strength of the government. So I'm wondering the kind of political toll that it takes on people in terms of strengthening the status quo when the city does get the Olympics. What happens politically afterward, and what kind of toll does it take on?
So it's
the opposing.
Thank you for your comment and question. I think it's dangerous to generalize, because some countries start off politically robust, more or less, and others start out, like Rio and Brazil, as politically very fragile and vulnerable. And if you try to foist this on a place like Rio, it's devastating. And Brazil, it's devastating. We can talk about that later afterwards. There's lots of details of political instability and the economic mess that has ensued from that. In terms of you mentioned politics. Because I was rushing over so many things. One of the things I found interesting, Boston a few years ago was trying to get the games for 2024. I was very involved in trying to talk them down, or at least get people to disengage from that process. one of the things that I didn't realize beforehand, I looked at a contract that Mayor Walsh, Boston Mayor Marty Walsh, signed with the USOC, which in turn had a contract, the United States Olympic Committee, in turn had a contract with the IOC. One of the clauses was something that we came to call the gag rule, and it stipulated that the city would enforce a policy of not allowing people employees of the city to speak out against the Olympic hosting possibility or to speak out in any negative way about the IOC itself, basically abrogating the First Amendment rights. There are lots of things in these contracts that you sign with the IOC or with the National Olympic Committee that curtail political freedom, and they create a great deal of resentment. Resentment is also created because a lot of concrete promises are made. In London, in East London, they were supposed to create, out of the Olympic Village, they're supposed to have 50,000, that's not right. They're supposed to have 20,000 condo units, and half of them were supposed to go to low-income housing, to affordable housing. That number got reduced, and ended up being 8%. So there's a lot of resentment, which also becomes a political issue going forward. In terms of the deception that you talked about, that's also ubiquitous. I was talking a moment ago about the China ski slopes. They're building high-speed rails to go from Beijing to the Nordic and the Alpine place. They're refusing to put those rails, the cost of those rails, in the Olympic budget because they say they were going to build them anyway. There was, however, an article in the Chinese press that estimated the cost at $5 billion for that. In the case of the 2020 Summer Olympics that are coming to Tokyo, the new female governor of Tokyo, Koike, did a study because she's looking at her accounts and seeing what kind of costs were involved. And they had published a budget of something like $13 or $14 billion. She had a independent study done that said that the cost, if we don't change what we're doing, the costs are going to be $27 billion. John Coates, the vice president of the International Olympic Committee, showed up in Tokyo a week later and said, we can't stand for this. He wasn't talking about the budget in Tokyo, he was talking about their reputation. He said this publicly, we can't let people know that it costs that much. You have to lower your budget. What did they do? They started taking items out of the budget. Not by not producing them, but just putting them off budget. So the Olympic Village is off budget. Many other things, and he eventually got the costs down to where he wanted them, basically $13 or $14 billion. Yes?
Patrick UEFA. Could you say a few things about the Barcelona Olympic Games and how they panned out? I know you have a positive example of Los Angeles. And then the other one, how do you see it working out for Paris and then later on for Los Angeles, because these bids have been approved and are on the table?
Sure. So Barcelona, very quickly, my read on Barcelona is that post-Franco, there was a lot of political openness, a lot of political debate, discussion in elected political bodies that wasn't happening beforehand, and that Catalonia was largely disregarded by Franco. And so you had a mess of development that blocked the central city from the sea. You had warehousing and industrial district that was in between the sea and downtown. And so these new political bodies in Catalonia and Barcelona made a plan to change their city in the late 70s. And the plan included some new transportation routes, new sewerage and stuff, but a large part of it was to move the industrial and warehousing district away so the city became open to the sea. Somebody then suggested in the early 1980s, hey, we could do all we're doing and host the Olympic Games. They had the Olympic Stadium and had many, I think 75% of the facilities they had already. And so they took the idea of hosting the Olympics and put it into their plan, a plan that pre-existed, and put it in a way that accelerated the possibilities for the plan to work. What happens, I think, in virtually every other case is you don't start with a plan and then use the Olympics to fulfill your plan. You start with almost nothing, and then you have to contort your city in order to accommodate the IOC. If you start with a plan, it's much more likely that the expenditures that you're making are going to be pro-development expenditures. If you start with nothing and you're accommodating the IOC, it's very likely you're building facilities that you don't need. Ask yourself the question, all of you, if a city didn't need a particular facility that it builds for the Olympics or the World Cup or whatever before the competition, why would it be the case that 21 days or 30 days after that they would all of a sudden need it? So that's the phenomenon of white elephants. That you've built a facility, it's cost you these days even $1.5, $1.7 billion to build one facility, or several $100 million. You've built it, but now you've got this thing. It's taking up 10 or 20 acres of land. You've got to maintain it or it goes to seed. People in Greece know about that. It's very difficult to think about this being a productive process, or being a process that doesn't rob the citizens, the local citizens, of needed inclusion and social services and participation. In terms of Paris, I think they're in trouble. The Olympic Village and many of the Olympic facilities are supposed to be in the Saint-Denis area. They're going to extend the metro there. It's now turning out that they don't have the money to extend the metro. I don't know how they're going to resolve that. I think it's going to be another case where they spend a bundle of money. It's not going to help very much. In the case of Los Angeles, 2028, Los Angeles is the second largest city in the United States. It's got UCLA, it's got USC, it's got at least one team in every professional sport league. So it has a gazillion stadiums, and it's got of every stripe and form. They don't have. There's one thing they have to build. It's a rowing facility. They're going to do it in the valley. So there's virtually no, and they have the necessary infrastructure as a developed city. They don't really have to do anything. They have a budget. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 billion. I think, especially with the corporate sponsorships that will be available to them, that they'll raise more than that. They've already gotten an advance from the IOC that they've put into further develop youth programs in Los Angeles. So I think it's going to be okay. I mean, it's not the case that I've never met a stadium or I've never met a sports investment that I don't like. I just think it has to be done in a certain way and with responsibility, and it can work out. So I think that's my projection for Los Angeles.
Thank you.
Yes.
Susan Brownell from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. So you're an economist, and you've just reduced the Olympic Games to profit considerations. Nico Besnier and I are anthropologists, and we've argued that the main driver behind the Olympic Games is actually what we call the gift economy. So if I could sort of borrow your analogy of a party, if you organize a party at your own house, you don't do it because you expect to make a profit off of it. You're trading in a lot of sort of intangible things like favors and reputation and prestige. And if you look at the Olympic Games, you find that in recent years, like starting with Beijing, London, there are more heads of state who show up at Summer Olympic Games than gather together on the planet for any other reason. There are probably more CEOs of multinational corporations there, although that's not really very well studied. But there may be more CEOs than, for example, gather at the Davos World Economic Forum. And celebrities converge on Olympic Games in droves. So, the leaders of the global political economy and culture, for some reason, feel that they have to be at Olympic Games. They have to see and be seen. Probably not strictly, for market calculations. And so, don't you think you might be missing a little bit of what's going on? Because they need the games. They are the global elite. They're partly driving the whole phenomenon. And that's why, the cities and the average people get screwed, really. It's because what's driving the games is this transnational phenomenon, a transnational elite that in the end doesn't really have a vested interest in whatever stadium, or whatever social inclusion is taking part on the ground in any particular host city.
It's a potlatch.
It's not quite a potlatch, but I agree with everything you're saying. I think that's right. It's driven by transnational elites, and it's fulfilling certain cultural and social functions for those elites. And I'm saying it doesn't make sense for the local population to be servicing those international elites. It turns out to be very expensive financially, very expensive socially, very expensive environmentally. So I feel free to borrow my metaphor of a party and talk about it. in 20 minutes, I can't possibly have addressed all of those different dimensions of it, but I think that's fundamentally what it is. If you can find a way to allow that to happen, when they have their economic summit in Davos every year, they don't have to rebuild all of the hotels to accommodate people. They don't have to build new ski slopes to accommodate people. They're there already, and it's a good business for Davos. God bless them that they're able to do that. But that doesn't mean that because Davos works that spending $15 or $20 billion in order to get a similar event makes any sense. Yes.
Millie Creighton, I'm here as a visiting scholar, but I'm generally at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver.
Lucky you. That's beautiful there. Yeah.
I just wanted to note, and you brought them up, so we did host the Olympics, the Winter Olympics in 2010. That
Yeah.
was preceded by about 3 miserable years of road reconstruction everywhere that was supposed to be an eventual benefit, but everybody's like, but I think there was a lot of popular understanding of the issues you brought up, and a lot of people who weren't keen on having the Olympics, so there was a big discussion. So they did agree to host a referendum, which you have mentioned, and we had a referendum. I did vote. I feel like this is one audience that might appreciate what I have to say, but so I went to vote. It was one question. It was a yes/no question. Behind our little cardboard cubicles. And the question was, do you or do you not approve of Vancouver hosting the Winter Olympics? Yes or no? And in a democratic process, they had a booth set up. If you had any concerns about the process, you could go talk to them. So I did, and I tried to explain that it was not an appropriate question because it's a so-called double-barreled question. Whether you agree or you disagree, the answer is yes, because it was do you or do you not approve? And they kind of looked at me and said, well, what basis do you say that? And I said, well, I'm a university professor, and I've taught social science methods courses, and of course they didn't care and thought I was.
But if you were indifferent, you'd vote no, right?
And we also, as we do with elections, we do them with a pencil that has an eraser in case you change your mind, but I've always wondered why somebody on the other side can't change your mind afterwards, but that's just in case one is cynical. But I did vote for the Olympics, but that was a referendum. But your talk has dealt primarily with the economic issues and that affect communities and cities for years. Something that became very big in Vancouver post the referendum. I think it was a journalist that got hold of some of the things that the Vancouver Committee offered to host the Olympics, one of which was that if there was any major thing that happened in Vancouver, a natural disaster, terrorist attack, any other kind of thing, that all of the Olympic teams and the people who came with that and would have access to medical care, hospitals, and medical treatment prior to all of the residents of Vancouver. And so when that came out, that was what really people were really upset about and triggered a lot of intense debate. So I think that adds to your issues of social concern.
Thank you.
We have one more question here.
Well, it's just more of a comment. I've also read that for individual athletes, there's very few that actually do well out of it, both economically and psychologically and physically. I mean, they still might say, yes, I would do it no matter what, but in the end, a lot of them end up with very little.
Right. People heard that comment? I mean, individual athletes don't fare very well. I mean, every country has their own system of remunerating them. Some remunerate strictly on the basis of their performance. Some give them a salary plus bonuses. None of them are paid handsomely. The ones who make out well are the superstars who get endorsement contracts. And just last week, the German Athletes Association, Olympic Athletes Association, sent a letter to IOC President Thomas Bach saying, you guys are spending too much money on administration and bureaucracy and flying yourselves around in first-class airplanes. We deserve more of it. You know, the Olympics were made until the 1980s, and 1986 in particular. The Olympics said that they were about amateurism. And amateurism is this old idea that it comes out of 19th century England, which was actually an effort to prevent working classes from playing sport. And it slowly broke down in the 1980s. the IOC started to say, okay, to each of the international sport federations, you can go ahead and do whatever you want. You can set your own policy. And in the 1990s, everybody opened it up. And so now it's supposed to be a commercial activity, except the athletes don't have people bidding for their services because there's only one National Olympic Committee. And hence there is a real question about how they're compensated, and something that the IOC is going to have to deal with. This gentleman has had his hand up for a
He's
while.
one of our Athens hosts too, so, yes.
Did you have your hand up? Did I see it up?
Yeah.
No, you don't?
Caucus,
You-
yes.
You're just going to smile at me.
First of all,
Oh,
congratulations for your presentation.
Thank you.
It's very interesting, and we can discuss topic by topic for many years.
right.
Discussing different arguments about that. I was working in the organizing committee of the Olympic Games in Athens 2004 as a head of media operations.
Hmm.
I think it's one of the most important things I've done in my life, of my country, myself. The question is if we want or not the Olympic Games. Olympic Games comes from the ancient years to the new era.
Yeah.
It's completely different, but it's not so easy to answer on that. If it was only a negative financial issue,
Yeah.
I don't think there would be so many bidders every time for that. Sometimes they can reduce that, as it was happening for Benzene and Korea Winter Games, but after that in Summer Games they increase again the numbers. Barcelona, I was there because we had to learn from them. The most successful games, from my point of view, ever, not only because of the Olympic presentation and the sports activities, but also for the city, because it was another city before,
Yeah.
another one,
Yeah.
and from 92 till today, the city is increasing always, the level of the city.
Yes.
And the revenues from the tourist factory are incredible after the games.
Yeah.
Before it was not existing anymore.
Yeah.
New railways, new airport, new constructions in the city, and also for Athens, a lot of questions about Athens. Was positive or not, negative or not, okay? Finally, the budget for the organizing committee was positive, but the budget of the constructions was negative. But I don't think that they can count under responsibility three issues. First one was the new airport. Second one was the ring road around Athens.
Right.
And the third one was the metro construction. All these did a transfer in the city of all of us in Athens. I don't think that anyone can count how many working hours can be saved with the new roads and the metro in a city who was suffered a lot before the games. And believe me, these three constructions could never have been done in Greece without the Olympic Games. and
Okay.
especially by
Well, so that's the key point. Yeah. Go ahead.
Concerning the IOC and the structure of IOC,
Yeah.
of course they started with the most royal families in the world, but last years I think they tried to change a little bit.
They did.
Because there are athletes' participation in the IOC, there are National Olympic Committees Association, there are a lot of new issues. There are many problems, from doping, from corruption, from all of this, but if we like Olympic Games, we have to have a more positive approach and try to find how we can better and not to stop them. Your proposal about the permanent location of the games and your proposal about somewhere between Athens and Olympia, ancient Olympia, has a very key point. And this was the mistake of Athens, because after the games in Athens, there is no one big organization in the country, because it was a change of the government 6 months before the games. And the new government decided that it was a project from the previous one, so we can let it forget. Instead of that, in London, immediately after the end of the games, the Prime Minister called Sebastian Coe and told me, we want more and more and more activities and concerts and games because we have the facilities and we need to get money from them. And they did it, and they are doing it continuously. And I think the same will be also in Los Angeles as it was in other countries. There are other examples like in Sydney, because now they don't know what to do with the Olympic Stadium, to destroy and do it again. Sorry for the long path.
Can I, thank you very much for your comment. And you said it would take days to go over all these points, and it would, so I'm just going to make one or two quick comments. I think that one can almost always...
The last one, sorry, because I forgot. The last one, it's financial. I'm not an expert, but I can say that because we've seen so many years
Yeah.
before. Of course, in the year of the games, the tourism is less than the previous because IOC and the organizing committee block many hotels and other issues. But if you can see the increase in numbers for the next years, it's tremendous for the city, and especially for our city. All
Okay.
the years after the games, except the year of the games.
Okay, so in terms of that last statement, you have to look at the previous trend to the trend afterwards, not just say that it's going up, because population is growing, income is growing, so other things being equal, tourism is going to grow. But look, the comment you made about the airport and the ring around the city in Athens, every city that spends $10 or $15 billion hosting the Olympics does infrastructural improvements. Part of the problem is that a large share of those improvements are improvements to connect one athletic venue to another venue or a hotel area to the athletic venues. The subway that they built to Baja in Rio, Baja da Tijuca, was an example of that. It's not a terrible, it's nice that they have the subway. It wasn't a high priority. Rio has a lot of high priorities. In the case where you're modernizing an airport and it was a priority, and it was one of the things that should have been done in 2002 and 3 and 4 in Athens, fine. If it needed to be done, do it anyway. You don't have to host the Olympics to modernize your airports. Lots of places modernize. The plan, you talked about Barcelona, the road plan in Barcelona was a plan that came from the 1970s. It didn't come, and that was my point about Barcelona. I agree it was a success. And one of the great things about Barcelona was that it was a hidden jewel of a city. And it's got great architecture, it's got great locations, it's got wonderful climate, and on. And it was basically like in the 21st place in the 1980s in Europe as places people visited. And now it's first, second, or third every year. So I think that there was a turning point. And I said I think that the Olympics there was a successful experience. Anyway, there's a lot more that you and I can discuss here. I think that we're done,
We
right?
need to wrap up and
Yeah.
move on to the next.
Thanks for listening, everybody.